Okay, so I'm super excited for this interview. This is an interview between PBD and Nick Fuentes. So this has been a long time coming. And so what I'm really glad about is that after all of this happening with Charlie Kirk, that we are seeing people wanting to have these conversations and kind of try to unite everyone and at least get on the same page. We are more divided than ever with people saying, hey, it's the left versus the right, and we're only going to unite or kind of put things aside within our own individual groups and all of that stuff. Not many people are wanting to reach across the aisle and unite regardless of your political party or your beliefs. And so we do have a lot of fracturedness within America. And so I was not expecting this interview to happen. However, I did see that Nick Fuentes mentioned that he had some big collaboration coming up, and it looks like one of those collaborations at least was with PBD. So I'm not someone who normally watches the Value Entertainment PBD content, but I did like that this was a one-on-one interview just between PBD and Nick Fuentes. I know that he normally has Vinny, Adam, and Tom there, but it was really nice just to have it be a one-on-one conversation, and I love that there was a lot of back and forth between PBD and Nick Fuentes. Now, just getting to my general thoughts about the interview, I thought that PBD did a good job of really holding Nick Fuentes' feet to the fire and really challenging him and asking follow-up questions, but then also holding him accountable for different things that have transpired throughout Nick Fuentes' political career. However, I did think that there were a lot of questions that were being asked that kind of were not relevant or slowed down the interview or the discussion, because at one point PBD asked if Ben Shapiro was married at some point of him and Nick Fuentes feuding, and so they confirmed that during the podcast that he was married, and I wasn't really sure how that was relevant to the discussion. I just had no idea how that was relevant, and so he did have to ask a lot of questions to kind of understand or get a better picture of what Nick Fuentes was talking about and what his journey within politics has been like so far. However, I thought that PBD did a great job of memorizing or remembering what Nick Fuentes had said, because at one point he was able to, at the very end of the podcast, he was basically able to kind of recall or remember the highlights of what Nick Fuentes had been talking about, and he was able to say, hey, this is what we talked about, blah, blah, blah. Here, give us a 3 to 5 minute pitch and finish that story and blah, 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 right? And so he had really good recall that he was able to remember stuff that was said earlier in the interview and then later come back to it. And I also thought that PBD, again, did a really good job of holding Nick Fuentes accountable. This is really good that this is coming from an older man to a younger man and saying, hey, you have a lot of people who are following you, a lot of young boys, 13-year-olds, that sort of thing. There are people who would look up to you, and you do have to take responsibility for the things that you say, and then naturally what happens as a result of that. However, it also is a wild concept when you think about everything that happened with Charlie Kirk, that some people get held accountable for the things that they say, whereas other people, they can just say whatever they want. And I'm not advocating for any kind of violence, but I think that there is a very flawed standard there to where we allow certain people to just say whatever, it's cool, it's acceptable, we ignore it, whatever. But for someone like Charlie Kirk, who really just debated and said things, he wasn't a violent person, he didn't physically harm anybody. I did see a Montel Williams clip when he went on, I guess, Fox News with Scott Jennings, and basically he was like, the shooter was defending the person that he loved, and that's not really defense. Charlie Kirk wasn't physically attacking, he wasn't beating Tyler Robinson's boy, he wasn't assaulting him or anything like that, right? He was just saying his ideas, he was having a debate, a discussion, he was talking about things, and so that was not self-defense of someone you love, it was cold-blooded murder. And so again, I just think it's really wild that some people can say whatever they want and they get held accountable, and then the way that we hold people accountable for different things is not consistent. And so I don't agree that violence is the answer, but it's really wild again, because I can't really fully comprehend one, that this happened to Charlie Kirk, and then also, as I've been talking about throughout my videos, just really not even being able to put into words to comprehend the depth of his impact, because you had over 100,000 people attend his memorial, you had over 1 million people watching the live stream and all of that stuff, and so it's just more comes out that surprises me and makes that depth even greater, if that makes sense. And so it's just really wild to understand someone's impact and not really being able to understand it and real time just how significant it is, but then also how we hold people accountable for what they say. Are we really understanding the message of what they said, or are we taking things out of context and all of that stuff? And so I think that this is a really good conversation between PBD and Nick Fuentes, where they're talking about things that Nick Fuentes has said and how it's being received and all of that stuff. One of the things that Nick Fuentes talked about in this interview was basically how he got into politics. He said that he had always been into politics since he was 12. He was involved in Model UN and all of that stuff, and he was really fine-tuning his debate skills and his ability to think critically on these very political topics that were being discussed. He also talked about Trump and basically how he was saying that in order for someone like Trump to get power, he understood that you have to basically conquer or address or engage with the media, and then Trump was able to do that effectively, and that was how he got power. And this is obviously leading to the whole fake news thing, to where anytime he gives an interview or a press conference or anything like that, he's able to say, hey, you're from so-and-so, you're not reputable, fake news, so on, right? And we can see the effect of that and how the mainstream media has been disempowered since Trump basically came into office and started running for president. The other thing that I thought was interesting, because I don't think I've really heard it in this way before from Nick Fuentes, but he talked about when he was younger and basically how he was looking at the voting patterns, and he was saying, hey, you know, white men vote this way, white women vote this way, black people vote this way, and he's really arguing that when you bring in immigration or people from other countries, they may be more likely to vote a certain way, which will change the voting patterns, which will change who is in office and what policies we put in place from there. And so he's really understanding the impact of what it means when you bring in millions of people from other countries who may be more likely to vote a certain way and then also don't assimilate into American culture. And I think that is important to recognize, because we have people who are Americans who move all over the country. They may move to a blue state, to a red state, and you can see just how within American culture, have an American citizen move from one city or one state to another, and they drastically change how that community looks and how it functions politically. One thing I really liked, though, is how he talked about his upbringing. He talked about where he was from and how it was a suburban white area, mostly, or all white area. They were really into baseball. There was kind of like this traditional culture with where he lived. And then when he went to Boston University, it was more diverse, a little bit of crime, he said, and it was just a very different feel and a culture shock for him when he went to Boston University. And so I kind of had that same experience. I grew up in North Carolina, smaller town, a smaller city actually compared to New York City, and it was a diverse area, but it was still kind of normal in a sense. I didn't experience a culture shock until I went to New York and I saw more minorities, different minorities, because mainly where I lived, it was just black, white, and Asian, and some Hispanic, really, right? But in New York, it's completely different. There's more minorities, especially where I lived, and you didn't see as many white people. Not that that's a bad thing, but I think it also just depends on what the cultural values are, how they see family, how they see the relationships between men and women, and that influences how that area kind of thrives and how it looks and how it functions, right? Because you can have an all-black neighborhood that is middle income, follows the rules, has good values, or looks like any traditional Midwestern white town, right? I think you can have those things happen, but it also matters how those communities are set up for success and how they perceive those values, because there is this sense that if you want to live in a small town, a middle-class neighborhood, and you want to have a good family structure, a nuclear family, that those are white things. And so I think you have to remove the stigma of those things being associated with white culture and realize that any culture can live that way. Any culture can live in an area that is not riddled with crime and has good family values. And when he was talking about how he grew up in that small white town that was really all about baseball, that type of stuff, it made me think of the Archie comics. And yes, there were one or two kind of minority characters in the Archie comics, and it also made me think of Riverdale, which is a little bit more diverse than the actual Archie comics. But then it also made me think of One Tree Hill, which is a TV show that I love, and there were some black people and other races in One Tree Hill, but it was all about that small town life where it was really big on family and community, and there was craziness that happened, but it was nothing like what you would see in New York City, LA, and Miami, and all of that stuff, right? And so I think that is aspirational. We should have a bunch of small towns all over the United States that are a little bit diverse, but they're also really about building up the local community, providing safe environments for people to raise their families, for having good schools to send your kids and all of that stuff. And so I don't think, again, that is just a white thing. Every culture should aspire to live in this way. But I think that because we associate it with white, and some people associate white with bad, that we kind of reject that, and that's not something that we should reject. And one interesting thing that Nick Fuentes brought up that I want to look a little bit more into, I've heard Candace bring up Thomas Sowell. I haven't really dug into him too much, but he did bring up this, I guess, series that he did on uncommon knowledge, and I do want to check that out. But I thought it was kind of ironic in a sense that he's quoting these Black people and all of that stuff and kind of learning about politics and getting his feet wet and really helping him to shape his understanding of politics, and he has the views that he had. And so I just found that interesting. I do want to check out Thomas Sowell's Uncommon Knowledge just to see what I can learn from that, but I was surprised that he was dropping these names of non-white people. Now, what I found super interesting was what he said about the Leadership Institute, and so I knew the backstory of what he had said about him and Cassie Dillon and Ben Shapiro, and how basically they loved him at first, but then once he started questioning things about Israel and all of that stuff, they basically disowned him, blocked him on a lot of platforms, that sort of thing. They basically tried to keep him from being successful and getting his voice out there. And he talked about the Leadership Institute and where he basically went for job training, realized after the fact that his name was basically trashed and taken away from the list of candidates, and so basically he was wasting his time there without really knowing it. But what happened was he was saying that he was having this 2 a.m. conversation with people who were his friends, and he was secretly recorded having this conversation about interracial relationships and people being involved with people outside their races. And I realized that in one of my last videos I kept talking about race mixing a lot, and that's actually not a term that I use. I just say interracial relationships, that sort of thing, mixed race relationships. And so anyway, he was talking about that, and they showed the recording during the video, and basically the girl was like, hey, are you saying that if I have sex with a Black person, that's like having sex with a dog? And so obviously those are two very different things, and one is actually very disgusting. The sex with the dog thing, that is like, that should not happen, and if you do something like that, there's something seriously wrong with you. Now, if you have sex with a Black person, that is a completely different ballpark. And so the fact that those two things are even in the same sentence, or it could even be seen as being comparable, is a really disgusting thing to say and to hear. And so I can absolutely understand why he would have been canceled over this, because even if you don't believe that people should get into interracial marriages, it is a huge thing to say that it's anywhere comparable to having sex with animals, because that's absolutely disgusting. Now, the one thing that I noticed when they were talking about this, PBD was really trying to hold him accountable for what he said. And so Nick Fuentes was basically saying, hey, this was a 2 a.m. conversation, and when you're in private with your friends, you may say something one way, but when you're in public, you may speak it a little bit differently. So I felt like he was really defending what he said, but he was really pushing back on the way that he was recorded saying it, which I think is a little bit problematic, because again, I don't think the two are comparable in any way, and there may be people who feel like that. Whatever, you can have your own opinion, right? But I think that that's something that was disgusting and should not have been said. And so I feel like in that sense, PBD was right to hold him accountable, because you, one, have to take responsibility for the fact that you said something and then the consequences of that. And then Nick Fuentes tried to point out this article that Ben Shapiro wrote, and basically he was talking about transferring people from Palestine to some other area, and he was equating this to ethnic cleansing. And I was actually more on PBD's side when he was arguing against that, because when you think of ethnic cleansing, you think of people being killed, wiped off the face of the earth, and their line doesn't exist anymore, their race doesn't exist anymore because they've been wiped out, right? And so it's a different thing entirely to move them from one location to another. Yes, it's still wrong to move them in that way, because you're just clearing out space so that you can steal what they have, right? And so that in itself is bad, but it's not the same thing as ethnic cleansing or a genocide, in my opinion. So I don't see how the two were the same and why he was making that comparison. However, I do think that Nick Fuentes was right when he was saying, well, if Ben Shapiro had wrote, Blacks and whites whites shouldn't live together, we should move all of the black people away, that absolutely would have been controversial, and it's hypocritical because he's talking about other ethnicities, Jewish people, Palestinians, that sort of thing. It didn't get criticized in the same way, and because he's a Jewish person, there was like minimal kind of backlash from that. And so I'm not super familiar with this article. I had not heard about it until he brought it up, but I do think that PBD is right here. You know, it's not really the same thing, but when Nick gave his analogy, I thought that was a fair point. So just going back to what Nick said on that secret recording, I think 99% of people would say that comment shouldn't have been made, and you may have 1% of people who agree with that comment. So I personally, again, do not agree with that comment that was made. I do want to point out that with him talking about, hey, you know, this was a 2 a.m. conversation, he didn't realize he was being recorded, you can kind of recognize when you're being asked a dumb question or a question that you should ignore or not even answer or entertain. And I feel like that was one of those moments, because what were they really trying to get you to say in that moment? They were obviously hoping that you would say yes, or that you would continue doing whatever it was that you were doing so that they could make you look bad. And so I think you have to be able to recognize when people are putting you in certain situations because they're trying to intentionally make you look bad, but at the same time you do have to own what you say. And so I think that that's definitely a tough situation, because you think you're among friends and then this happened. And that's kind of like the Hulk Hogan thing, where he had his voice messages released where he was dropping the N-word. And so a lot of people are saying, no, this is a private conversation that should have never been made public. But when you are doing things in the privacy of your home, and when you think no one is watching, you should be able to have those vulnerable moments where you say things that you normally would not say in public. But I think there are levels to what those things are, right? Like, obviously, you should not be super racist in the privacy of your own home and then pretend that you're not racist out in the real world. Like, that's kind of like two-faced in a sense. And so I think that what I'm trying to say is that yes, there are things that happen in the privacy of your home, but I think there are even levels within your home that you shouldn't stoop to in order to have this conversation with friends, or because you think no one else is going to hear those conversations. And this is not to pick on Nick or anything like that. This is just more of a kind of neutral kind of observation about the discussion that they had on this point, because again, there are younger people who are watching Nick Fuentes, PBD, and all of that stuff, and they're going to take away their own thoughts on this conversation. But I did just want to add my own thoughts to the conversation as a Black person and as a woman, and how I perceive those comments. And I'm just really glad that PBD held him to this and really tried to push the conversation again, because this is a older man speaking to a younger man. This is a Syrian man speaking to essentially a white person, and really saying, hey, you know, we have to be responsible with what we say, because we do have younger people who are looking up to us and who are going to repeat what we say and also adopt our ideology. Now, this leads me into basically the conversation on role models, and PBD was really saying that Charlie Kirk was his number one guy. If he had a dream team of people that he would want on his team, Charlie Kirk would be the first person that he picked. That really speaks to Charlie Kirk's influence, the way that he carried himself, how he was about his faith, and how he was about his politics. And so we get to this point where PBD, he pulled up this chart, and it's a map of consciousness, and he's basically talking about how you can influence, I guess, either through power or force. And so he starts with shame, and he's basically trying to figure out where Nick Fuentes is on this chart. And I think Nick is probably between anger and pride, because he is really kind of reacting to the agenda against him to deplatform him and silence him and make sure that he can't get his message out there. So he really is operating from a level of anger. And PBD said that Charlie Kirk was operating from love and reason, and that was really because of his religious principles and how he perceived the world and the impact that he wanted to have. Because in a sense, you could say that Charlie Kirk had a lot more to lose than Nick Fuentes, and so he's going to operate in a completely different way just from that position. But he also operated from a point of love and reason. He was respectful to everyone, even though he did not agree with your lifestyle. He was still respectful for you, still prayed for you, that sort of thing, right? And with Nick Fuentes, yes, he's operating from his religious principles, but that looks very different, especially with him being blackballed the way he is, and he's operating more from a place of anger. And you can kind of see that coming out in his videos and the way that he communicates his message. Sometimes with him, you're not sure if he's trolling and all of that stuff, right? And so what got to me is when Nick Fuentes started talking about Charlie Kirk. He was very clear, like, this is my nemesis. I didn't agree with his politics. And aside from the issue of Israel, I'm not sure what else they would have disagreed on. But it's really interesting when you think about, you can agree with someone on 90% of the things, but the 10% that you don't agree on is what you're fighting viciously over, which is really crazy. So we should really be focusing on what we have in common with people versus what we have as far as differences. And what really got to me was how he was saying, Charlie Kirk, this vicious, violent act happened to him, but he's not the worst guy in the world. He's not the worst guy on the planet. And so that is really crazy, going back to how I was saying that people are held accountable for the things that they say. Charlie Kirk, you may not have liked his opinions, but nothing that he said warranted him being killed the way that he was killed, because there are worse people on the planet. There are people who are assaulting people, beating people, verbally abusing people, who are just enacting terror everywhere they go, and those are worse people. And people like that are still alive and still allowed to continue to terrorize other people, and we don't hold those people accountable socially. We don't say, hey, that's not acceptable. We don't shun them. We just allow them to continue doing what they're doing. But for someone like Charlie Kirk, who was a man of principle, who did have a faith that he operated based on, he was quickly seen as a threat and taken out. And so it's just really sad when you have people who, one, don't understand what he was all about or what he even said because they're listening to clips that are out of context, and you have that lead to something like this that should have never really happened. If you disagreed with what he said, you should have went to one of his debates and debated him and had those conversations. You could have emailed him, because I think they were saying that he read every email, and some of those email chains were 6 or 7 messages deep. So if you really wanted to have a conversation with Charlie Kirk, if you really wanted to advocate or defend someone that you love, you should have first engaged in a debate. And if you didn't even try to do that, and your first act is violence, is really crazy to me. And one other thing that Nick Fuentes said about Charlie Kirk, because I did cover his episode where he talked about his thoughts, I think 1 day or 2 days after the assassination, and he was really saying, hey, we need to not retaliate in violence, we need to unite. If you are someone who is laughing or celebrating this, you need to repent, and if you have repented, then we can kind of unify with you. But again, this is a battle between good and evil, and we have to recognize that without being violent. We need to socially shun those people, right? And so I really like that he came here and he was basically talking about how Charlie Kirk, even if you don't like his politics, he's going to be remembered for his faith and the way that he followed Christianity and his Christian principles and everything that he was advocating in that sense. But then in terms of his politics, he was saying, we sabotaged him in the beginning. The Groiper War, we went to his events, we challenged him on being pro-gay, pro-Israel, all of that stuff, and he was just really saying how for him, Turning Point USA, he kind of coined it Talking Point USA, because he was really kind of just like the mouthpiece for the Republican Party. And I think that you can feel however you feel about his politics, but you can recognize too that he was a strong man in terms of his faith. He really tried to live by his principles and live out his principles, even if you disagreed with his politics. I think that too is what a lot of people are responding to, just seeing this role model, this example of how a man should be. And even if you don't agree with his politics, he does have the right to say what he believes, and you can have that open debate, open discussion with him. That's how you kind of settle things when you don't agree with someone. But I think a lot of people will find that they probably have more in common with Charlie Kirk than there are things that they disagree on. And so I really like that Nick Fuentes pointed that out, that yes, he does respect how hard Charlie Kirk worked, even if he didn't agree with his politics. Now, getting into kind of more so what Nick believes, you would think that he might be more aligned with someone like Thomas Russo. I do not know who this person is, but from how they were discussing him during this interview, they were basically talking about how he is a white nationalist, he is more racialist than Nick Fuentes is, and he was saying that he didn't agree with that level or that type of activism. And so I found that super interesting, because it's interesting how you can have people who are white nationalists or who you would say are white supremacists, but they have varying levels on what that means and what that looks like. And so I'm not going to go down the rabbit hole with that or anything like that, but I find that that is super interesting, because on the flip side, you can have people who are very pro-black and they're radical, and then you can have other people who are pro-black but it looks very different. And so I just find that super interesting, that you would think that someone who you should have more in common with, you actually don't agree. And so the point is there's disagreement on so many different issues, and even within the same political party or the same ideology, and I find that super interesting as well. Now, the other thing they talked about before they wrapped up this interview was on immigrants, and so Nick was saying that he doesn't really have an issue with immigration in the general principle or general sense of the idea, but he had a problem where you're intentionally bringing in millions of people each year and you're drastically changing what America looks like. And so I think when Nick talks about where he grew up and what that looks like, you can kind of see how someone would want to protect that and preserve that, especially with him talking about the culture shock of going to Boston and seeing what that looks like. And so I don't think it's a bad idea to want to preserve small towns as long as it's inclusive of everyone. So I don't think it's a bad thing that he wants to preserve that small town that he grew up in, but you can have that in a more diverse area. You can have that with more ethnicities in your small town, right? It doesn't have to be this all white thing, but I think first you have to get rid of the idea that that is only a white thing and realize and recognize that other ethnicities and they can have that too. And so I think that that's what we should all strive for. I love living in a smaller city. I did love living in New York, but I also, since moving back to where I grew up, it is a very different environment. It's more peaceful, and I love that. And I don't think it's necessarily just because I live in a majority white area. I think it's just because of the culture and the values and all of that stuff. You have to assimilate into that small town life, that small city life that is oriented around the local community and creating a family environment. If you live in an area where it's all about being single and being chaotic and crazy, your values are naturally not going to lead you to that small town, small city life I think everyone should strive for. In terms of fundamentally altering America, I think that that is a real concern. And one of the things that they talked about was identity politics and how, yes, you can bring in immigrants who contribute to America, who are productive members of society. But when you do that, are they identifying with America first or whatever their ethnicity is? So I'm reading a book called Americana. I'm not going to pronounce the author's name because I don't want to butcher it, but it is a really fascinating read so far. And I came across a point where they're basically talking about the difference between Africans and African Americans, and they're talking about people who have immigrated to America from Africa, and they were talking about this idea of saying African American. These people will say they are American African, which I thought was a very interesting way to think of it, because usually you hear people say, oh, I'm Jewish American, or I'm African American, or I'm Chinese American, but I've never heard it the other way where they say I'm American Chinese, and I think that there's a different connotation with that. I don't really know entirely how that fits into this conversation, but I do think it is super relevant when you think about people who have certain identities and you have to figure out what they identify with more. Do they identify with their home country or their ethnicity first, or do they identify with being American first? And I love that he brought up this idea of how the mayor of Minneapolis, Jacob Frey, I'm not sure if it's Jacob Frey or Fry, something like that, so I do apologize for saying his last name incorrectly, but I did see this myself on Twitter where it was saying that he was doing ads in Somalian, which I think is super interesting because you do have people who are at one point doing ads in Spanish, or they would have the Spanish translation at the bottom, so that is super interesting when you think about people doing that, but it's also about the area where you live and who's there. So if you live in a predominantly black area and you're the mayor of that area, then obviously you're going to speak to the people that are in that area and reach them the way that you can reach them. So I think it is interesting that he is doing ads in Somalian, but I don't really know what that means in terms of the rest of America, because he's not the mayor of America, he's the mayor of Minneapolis, which has a certain demographic, right? And so I find that super interesting, but I don't know how it fits into the bigger conversation in terms of saying that this is inherently wrong because the rest of America doesn't speak Somalian, right? And so that ad is not going to reach them, but they are going to have their opinions and their perspectives on what that ad inherently means, right? And so I do find that to be an interesting conversation. I'm not sure how I feel about it, but I know that there's a bigger conversation going on around if you're from another country, what do you identify with more, your country that you're from or America? The other thing I found interesting was the idea of the melting pot. I've always heard that. I remember in middle school, I was taking an art class, and that was what I drew as my painting. It was a literal melting pot with different people in it. And so I've always been familiar with the term, and that basically just means to me we have a bunch of different ethnicities, skin colors, religion in America, but we've all come together to kind of create America that is super diverse. And obviously understand that we have like a national language, English, and all of that stuff, right? And you assimilate into the American culture. But he was talking about this more as a bad thing, because obviously he was saying that, you know, America used to be more white and it should be more white, but I also have never kind of pushed back or thought negatively of the idea of a melting pot. I think that when you think of American culture, you think of that small town, small city life where it's really family oriented, and I think getting away from that is the real problem, not necessarily the people that we're bringing in, the religions or the ethnicities of people that we're bringing in. It's when you bring in people who don't strive for that. They're not all about their families, they're not all about creating safe environments, and they're all about kind of devaluing American culture. Because yes, being American is like baseball, caring about your family, sending your kids to a good school, and being involved in your local community, right? And I don't think that that is centered around a specific ethnicity or race. And so I think anybody can have that, but when you have people who aren't striving for that and who are striving for chaos and really just disrupting things, I think that that is a bigger problem than bringing in people of different races. And so for me, I've never really thought of the melting pot analogy or comparison as being a bad thing. I think it's more about the values and the culture that you're promoting without it being necessarily tied to race or ethnicity. Alrighty, so that is everything I wanted to talk about in this interview. I did enjoy this interview. I thought it was a super fun conversation to listen to, and I do hope that they have more interviews, especially because this has been a long time coming, where he did not want to platform or talk to Nick Fuentes because he was using the N-word. And I think it is interesting to think about it in that term, because there are so many terms that are offensive that are being used and all of that stuff. And so I think the N-word, I know it gets mixed reactions where Black people can say it, but white people can't say it, other races can't say it. And I do think that the context matters when you say it, especially with the N-word meaning different things to so many people. And so I'm glad that they moved past that and were able to have this conversation. I thought that PBD did a really good job of pushing back and holding him accountable, but he also made it clear that he wasn't really trying to speak down to Nick Fuentes or kind of just treat him as lesser than. He really wanted to say, hey, you know, can you see and understand that that may not have been the best way to do that? And I think PBD, in my opinion, this could be a flawed analysis, but I think that PBD was the right person to hold him accountable and say all of that to him as an older man, as someone who is a different race and all of that stuff. Like, this cannot come from Candace, this cannot come from Tucker, because Tucker, white man, Candace, Black woman, and all of that stuff, right? And so I think that it is interesting, and I hope that PBD made a little bit of a difference in terms of how Nick Fuentes sees his rhetoric and his messaging going forward, because if you want to create a society that is inclusive of everyone, that is impacted by the language that you use and the way that you talk about things. And so I think that's the difference between Charlie Kirk and Nick Fuentes. I talked about that in my last video, where Charlie Kirk was more inclusive in the sense that he was saying, you know, this is what we should strive for. We should be all about faith. We should be all about telling the truth. But he did it in a way, at least from the stuff that I've seen as far as videos and clips, he did that in a way that was more positive and uplifting and wanting to wake people's eyes to the truth. Whereas Nick Fuentes, when he does it, it's a little bit more divisive because of the language that he's using and how extreme he is in getting his message out there. But I do think that it is important to understand that if you really want to move to having this one culture of American culture and what that looks like, you have to do it in a way that is inclusive of everyone, but it's also in a way that doesn't deny the truth or biological realities of the world that we live in, and just really understanding that we're all one human race and we all deserve to have the American dream. So with that being said, feel free to go off in the comment section, talk about this interview and what your thoughts are on Charlie Kirk, PBD, and Nick Fuentes. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.